Thank you very much, Joseph, and I'd like to thank the committee for giving me this honor to deliver this lecture. Now, you reflect back and look at what happened in terms of history of endoscopy and its developments. There are two phases actually. The first phase is the very early phase when we had several pioneers in endoscopy who were not only pioneers in the sense that they invented new things, but they also were very courageous because they tread on new path which has never been taken before. The second era of innovations came in 1970s, and there are some from Hong Kong also here, who were pioneers, who were innovators, teachers, masters, who, it was during this time in 1970 and 80 that there was a huge flood of innovation that was occurring in endoscopy. And what happened subsequently was over the last 30 years, the innovations have actually come down. If you look at the literature, it was only in 1990s that the first randomized controlled trials in endoscopy came. And till this time, there were a lot of innovations, and suddenly the literature became very strong, evidence started appearing very strongly, but innovations came down. And I'll go into this later on, but this was a very paradoxical thing that happened. In fact, the endoscope that we're using now is 50-year-old. It's not been changed. It's the same design that we've been using. So that one sometimes wonders whether this is the best innovation that ever happened in endoscopy. After that, there's not been anything which dramatically changed endoscopy. But if you look at what is happening in other fields, you can see there's dramatic changes. For example, NASA already has a robotic eel which can crawl on distant planets. And similarly, our molecular biologists have endoscopes which can be passed into a single cell to look at the organelles. And what do we have? It took us almost 60 years to progress from identifying a lesion which is about 3 centimeters to 0.5 centimeters. It took us such a long time. So we haven't really progressed as rapidly as what is happening in other fields. But the technology is there. In fact, this is the technology that's available for the last 10 years. These are single fiber scanning endoscopes, which in the single small fiber, you can not only get excellent pictures, you can get therapy, you can do integrated laser imaging and so on. Yet, this is still not commercially available. What's actually discouraging innovations in endoscopy is there are several, and this is my thought process, regulatory process, culture, mindset, and economic issues. Now, culture and mindset in general, it's believed that the Eastern culture doesn't encourage innovations, that we are more hierarchical and that innovations is much more coming from West. That was the original thought. But it's the regulatory process that is causing a problem all over the world. In fact, this is an example. These are two devices which showed very good clinical results for obesity, the TOGA and TERES. Both of them in a small group of patients showed that they were very effective in reducing weight in the patients. But what happened? The regulatory process in the United States told this device industry that they had to do tests of at least 10 times in size in terms of patient number so that this could come into use commercially. But this couldn't be done because of economic reasons, and both these are dead now. They're no longer available commercially, and I'm sure not in future. So this is one of the problems that we have. In fact, again, as I said, this is the mindset that we often have, at least in India, this is common. If you take a very innovative approach to somebody who's very senior, he'll say, this is an innovative approach, but I'm afraid we can't consider it. It's never been done before. Naturally, any new innovation would not have been done before, but to break this mindset is something which is going to be extremely difficult for us. In 2002, the National Institute of Health had a very unusual conference. They actually looked at the science of ERCP. Normally, NIH doesn't like endoscopies. They never have a conference with endoscopies, all basic scientists and so on. But in 2002, NIH had a conference where they tried to look at the science of ERCP and look at what they found. At that time, 22 years of ERCP, they could only find 14 selected for review, and only 19%, that is 149 articles, had evidence which was strong enough, which means the science of ERCP, even after 25 years, was not strong enough. And there are several reasons for this, because if you're looking at evidence-based endoscopy, there are several difficulties we have, difficulties in comparing different types of patients, and therefore many of the studies have heterogeneity, and the most important is there's huge operator variability in many of these studies. The patient numbers are low, and often comparison with gold standards like surgery is very difficult, and therefore endoscopic evidence has never been strong. So you want to make an innovation, and then you want endoscopic evidence to support it. It's going to be extremely difficult. So what happens in endoscopy is that the progress occurs incrementally over 10 years interval. And look at this, 1970 ERCP, The first plastic stent for obstructive jaundice came in 1980, 10 years later. And 10 years later, we started using the first self-expandable metal stent. And again, 10 years later, we have started using the covered self-expanding metal stent. So it took such a long time. And nothing has happened dramatically in the last 15 years. We wait beyond this. We wait for biodegradable stents with steroids impregnated for benign strictures. We wait for PDT stents, which are already now experimentally being done to use in patients with cholangiocarcinoma. But again, these are not commercially available. So huge, long gap it took us. And this is well illustrated in this study. We published this recently in Gastroenterology, just to show that in patients with benign biliary strictures, if you want to actually treat them, the traditional treatment has been multiple plastic stents. But can we replace with something simpler? Something simpler is to put in a self-expandable, completely covered stents and remove this after 12 months. But this study to plan took us a couple of years, 5 continents, 11 centers, millions of dollars, and finally we came to a conclusion it could be done. So you see how difficult it was. Just a small step, a small incremental change in endoscopic thought took us such a long process. What actually initially changed, we thought would change endoscopic approach, something which was going to dramatically alter the way we do endoscopy, is the concept of nodes, which came in 2000 because of Tony Kallu and his group in Johns Hopkins. We did the first human peroral appendectomy, but unfortunately the whole concept of nodes died, mainly because there was no support from the industry, we didn't have instrumentation and so on. So a very innovative process, thought process came, but vanished because of this problem. And this is one of the problems that I'm going to discuss further, that some of the things that came from nodes were these plicating devices. The eagle claw now, which is actually originated from Hong Kong, is 8 generations old, but still it's not commercially available. We have now closing devices like this, a clip on top of the endoscope to close openings which are made, and now we have this device which is a full thickness resection device which has a lot of indications, but unfortunately can take only small lesions. And what we require actually is a device like this. This is a flexible stapler. A company called the Power Company actually made this 10 years back. 10 years back. And just imagine if the endoscopist had this device. You can be like a surgeon. Go along with the endoscope, look at the lesion, and already the initial cases were reported in endoscopy. Remove the whole full thickness lesion by stapling. And that such a useful device never came into market because the company did not have the money to commercialize it. So this was a very innovative device which never went into a commercial benefit for the patients. And look at another area, potential for GI pacing. If you actually look at the market for cardiac pacing, it's $5 billion. For neuro pacing, $1 billion. And the GI tract works with the electrical currents all over. It has more neurons than the entire spinal cord. It has 3 types of excitable cells, and there's a huge number of conditions which can be treated by pacing. Yet we do not have a pacing device for GI tract. In fact, we worked on this some time back where we actually looked at patients to see if you can stimulate the lower field sphincter by electrical pacing, and we put in these very crude cardiac pacing devices. And then when we actually induced an electrical current, the sphincter was closing very tightly. And what happened was that you can see the pressures were markedly increasing. Endostim is a company which decided to make these small remote control electrodes which could be put into the LES, and then you can remote control close the LES. But again, huge regulatory problems, they couldn't do this. But what happened was the laparoscopic surgeons picked it up very rapidly, and now we have a commercially available laparoscopic aided device which can be put in at the LES, and you have a remote control way to actually close your lower field sphincter. So this is already available now. So as endoscopies, you're falling behind, whereas other areas are taking over from us. For example, look at what happened with capsule endoscopy. When it came, it was game changer. 2007, the last major development occurred. And what do we want from this? We want something like this, instruments to do therapeutic procedures for us. Unfortunately, this hasn't arrived. So what we have now is, again, look at this is Paul Swain. If we can take off the audio, because Paul Swain groaning is not a good side. So Paul Swain trying to get himself endoscoped with the capsule inside, manipulating with the magnetic paddle here. This is just 2 years back, but if you actually look at what can be done, look at what is happening in NASA. NASA has a special capsule which can go on to any asteroid which is approaching the Earth. They already have this. It can go and stick there and redirect the asteroid so it doesn't come and hit the Earth. They have capability to put this robotic machines into Mars and take remote controlled biopsies from the rocks there. And that we are still struggling with our crude biopsy forceps endoscopes. These technologies are not getting transmitted to endoscopy, and this is what we'd like it to do. This is something that some of you have seen. This is what we want. We want a patient who is about to have hematemesis, doesn't have to come to the hospital, just has to take a capsule, and all these technologies are available. They just have to be put together, transmitted by broadband to her gastroenterologist. She's in the house watching World Cup finals. And this is actually France versus Germany. World Cup. This is a very interesting.
Both managers were on
and then he starts appearing PIP, and then so still he doesn't have to worry. He just enlarges the picture, and then you can see that there is a bleed here, Dulophi ulcer which is bleeding, and you can see this patient doesn't have to rush to the hospital because the same remote control, he has the capability to open and get out a clip here. The clip goes in. You can direct it. As I said, these technologies are available. They just have to put it, and then the bleed stops. So he's very happy about it. And the patient goes back to sleep, doesn't have to come to the hospital. Very important because the last goal was just scored then, and then he didn't miss this goal. So I think this is what we want, but unfortunately still not available. But actually, if you look at the technology is available, this is the Israel Institute of Technology, which has got this small micro robotic device which can be guided in and out of small tubings like this. This technology is available, but unfortunately it's not being applied commercially to endoscopy for reasons I'll tell you later. This is something that you must have seen Guido's talk last year, how Shinya made the first polypectomy snares in 1960s, and when he sent it to Japan to get it commercially made, the company studied this for about a year and said the whole idea is very dangerous and cancelled it. You see, 40 years later, polypectomy has become one of the main methods of how we are treating patients with colonic polyp to decrease the incidence of colorectal carcinoma.
On my left-hand side is
25 years back, distinguished
the whole
team.
They have seen the complete
team.
team.
Can you get the volume of
a mini
volume?
team this morning.
These are two young endoscopists. You'll recognize them, Hagenmuller and Thomas and Horst Neuhardt, so actually demonstrating. So he didn't realize it was so powerful when he put it on his lip earlier. So they're demonstrating this technique of baby scope. This was 25 years back. And 25 years, there's no progress that has been made in this area. Only now we have a digital cholangioscope. Probably you'll see it in the workshop tomorrow. And with this, now we have the capability of totally changing the way we do ERCP without radiation, direct visualization. And we have the capability of putting the small CMOS chips into all our catheters. These are very cheap, $10 so you can get the small chips. They can be put into every catheter that we use as endoscopists. So therefore, the whole concept of doing endoscopy changes completely. Now, this was a Harvard business study which actually looked at how technologies will change in future. And you'll see here very clearly that both information technology and businesses take up technology very quickly. Healthcare does it the least. Healthcare doesn't take up technologies quickly. And there are, of course, several reasons for this, including patient safety and so on. But I think there are problems with innovations in our process. And how do we change this? How do we encourage innovations? Of course, regulatory processes are very difficult to change. We don't have any role. Different governments have different processes and so on. Some of the patent issues we could address. And of course, I think these are the two most important things. This was several years back. We made a special balloon needle stenting device, which at the single go could go inside a necrotic area, make an opening, balloon dilate, put a stent, and come off. Unfortunately, when we tried to give it to a company so that they could commercialize it, they couldn't do, because every individual part of this, like the needle going in, the balloon, the stent, have been individually patented. For the company, there's no interest at all. They couldn't do anything with this. So it's just left alone. It's no longer available commercially. So this is one of the problems that we have. But the most important issue, I think, is that we should shift from industry to university. What happens now in endoscopic field is that if you want to do something, the industry comes up with an instrument, and they will tell you, can you find an indication for this instrument and do this? And so we take this, say we try and find an indication and use the instrument. If it's not useful, it's thrown off. So this is how the process occurs. We should change this. And this can be changed only if you have funding from the university. And this is to Joseph, because he's the Vice Chancellor. maybe more funding gets from the university to the hospitals for doing this type of research. In fact, unfortunately, all over the world, this is not happening. These are statistics from NIH. This is old, but I just rechecked the latest ones, and it's similar, that endoscopy is the most underfunded area in the branch of medicine. You see a lot of funds to hepatology, inflammatory bowel disease and all. Unfortunately, endoscopy is not so funded because I think this is traditionally happening. This has to change because as we know that it's the economy which makes the whole thing grow. If you don't have to depend upon industry, if you don't have to depend upon something being very successful economically, then we can innovate better. So see the example, industry started getting out these instruments, we started trying to apply it for GERD, and all of them have gone into graveyard. None of them actually are available now. So a natural history of any endoscopic product that occurs is that when a new procedure comes, it becomes a new fashion. Everybody does it till you have randomized control trials, regulatory bodies, or multicentric trials, and then three things happen. It can be used, which is a low percentage, low usage, or graveyard, and mainly because of complications. This is what happens. So what happens is that if we depend on industry now, industry is going to knock this off. We have a very small percentage of innovations that are going to come into market. This is a problem. So it has to be investigator-related approach, and this is an example of what happened here to POEM, that this was an investigator-related approach to this, no dependence on industry. When POEM initially came, if it had an economic reason to sustain itself, we wouldn't have sustained. It would have gone off because balloon dilatation was easier, cheaper, and so on. But it sustained because it was not dependent on that. And now, of course, it's become a part of our algorithm for treating patients with achalasia cardia. Of course, but we want it to be much more easier. We want innovations to go to this level where you don't have to even be a skilled endoscopist to do a POEM. We want an instrument like this. Again, technology is available. This is an instrument which is swallowed by the patient and then goes inside and then can make a small opening in the mucosa. It makes an opening, goes inside. Again, I said these are technologies available because if you go to oil industry, they're using this technology. In North Sea oil, when they do oil this thing, they do use this. Or similarly, the NASA is using it. So the muzzle layer is clearly delineated, and it makes a cut in the muzzle layer, avoids blood vessels, and of course, you can come out very safely and close this opening. So these are technologies. You can see this is something that we want, so you don't have to be an endoscopist to do this. And finally, the most important thing I think is what is going to change innovations in endoscopy is an interdisciplinary approach. We have to get together different groups of people to do this from different approach. In fact, Tom Freston has written a famous book on this, says very clearly, the innovation is taking two things that are already existing. Something may exist in area of physics or chemistry and putting it together with the endoscopist. This is what innovation is. So it's not something, you don't have to invent always. You can put all things together and get something new. In fact, if you put some of them, especially the younger brains together, give them enough time, caffeine, and probably some beer, you'll invent something useful most of the times. I think this is something that we're not doing, interdisciplinary approach. This is a very interesting book from James Sowersky, and what he clearly states is this is what is happening in business. The crowds are much smarter than individuals, and collective wisdom of different branches of sciences coming together can result in massive innovation. And in technology-related subject like ours, I think this is very important. In fact, we did a conference sometime back called for robotics and endoscopy, and what we did was we got the top endoscopists in the country sitting on one side of the table, and we got the top robotic scientists, engineers sitting on the other side of the table. We asked our endoscopy colleagues to think of a crazy idea, and then the opposite person on the table tells us whether it's possible or not. And every crazy idea by the endoscopist, the engineer said, oh, it's very easy, you can do this. They said, we can easily make an intelligent guide wire which goes selectively into the bile duct or into the pancreatic duct. All these are technologies available. Only thing, we're not putting them together. So, for example, the surgeons have taken this robotic surgery. They have it for many years. It took us a long time, and this is a study that was done here in the Institute of Digestive Diseases along with our institute, and the main person who drove this was an engineer in Singapore along with Lawrence Ho, putting this small flexible robotic devices, and you can see the huge advantage this had. We could do these large ESDs in just about 7 minutes time. So we don't require to be very skilled endoscopists. In fact, this was called a small case series, it's a giant step. Unfortunately, again, we have to depend on industry to commercialize this. The second generation is coming out, is taking some time, but as I said, this again, because we are industry dependent. Jack Davier and his unit now have created a unique atmosphere in their unit in Brussels, where they have actually scientists working in the department. They are part of the department, and they've created these new types of endoscopic devices, which I think are going to change the future. We also can combine with our basic scientists. Yamanaka got the Nobel Prize for iPSC technology, induced pluripotent stem cell technology, 2 years back. And this is a basic scientist actually converting fibroblasts into lower esophageal sphincter muscles. They can do it very easily. Now the IPS technology is so strong that you can convert any cell into any cell in the body. You can take fibroblasts and you can change them into any cell you want. And just imagine, as endoscopists, we have the capability to go to any part of the GI tract. You just create a new LES here. You can, this is again something that we should utilize in future. Already some of this, the Japanese are doing, putting sheets of the post-ESD, in these cases to prevent strictures. But again, we require something which is little more easier for non-endoscopists to require. We require tissue engineering devices like this. This is something which is used in the leak in the pipes that are there, the oil pipes. The engineers use this device. They actually put this device inside, and what it does is it transforms itself into whatever way you want, identifies the area where there's a defect, and then goes and covers this defect. And in this case, of course, this is a defect in the esophagus, and this can be completely, there's a web spun there closing the defect. The other area where we can combine is with surgeons, and this is resulted in hybrid endoscopy, where we do endoscopy transluminal and the surgeon is watching with a small peritoneoscope, and I think we have to break the barriers between surgeons and physicians. And again, this is a very good example at the institute here, where surgeons and physicians are working together to create this type of techniques. With a metabolic, the endocrinologists, again, we can go together. It's a new technology that's coming up, and hopefully in a few years' time, this will be something that we as endoscopists are doing, treating patients with type 2 diabetes. And the concept is that in patients with type 2 diabetes, the abnormality is not in the pancreas, but in the second and third part of the duodenum. They have an abnormal neuroendocrine system with altered ratios of incretins and anti-incretins. If you can actually destroy this, and the device that's available now is called the Revita device, and there's a large study in Europe in different centers going on, which is trying to use this, and some very early results which seem to suggest that this is very effective in controlling type 2 diabetes. So I think soon, with these innovative techniques, as endoscopists will be treating diabetes, and you can imagine the potential that we have. Another area, I think this again contribution from the Hong Kong Center, where it's a combination of endoscopist industry and the army coming in here. This was a device which was used in the armed forces in the United States to stop bleeds. They actually used it to stop ulcer bleeds here. And now, of course, people are starting to use it for variceal bleeds also. And lastly, the navigation systems that are available everywhere, we can start using it on endoscopes to navigate, to see what's outside the lumen and so on. And this has shown to significantly increase our endoscopic skills. In fact, if you go to any theaters now, if you go to any neurosurgery theater or orthopedic surgery theater, you'll find these navigation systems already there. This is not new. They have it, they take their CT scans, MRI scans, integrate it, and then create a hologram on which they can operate. We can do it endoscopically also. We can create this so that once you have this, we can go in endoscopically, go to the papilla, and then automatically you know where the blood vessels are, so you don't produce a bleed when you cut and so on. So these things, again, we can do it endoscopically. When you talk about innovations in general, there are 4 types. The breakthrough ones, which actually totally change the way we practice medicine, sustaining ones, the new market, and of course the disruptive ones. And disruptive ones are the most important, because disruptive technology enables less skilled people to do more sophisticated things. And this is what, in general, as an endoscope community we are looking at. And capsule endoscopy was one example when it came. For a successful adaptation of process, there should be a large felt need, simplicity, safety, and of course efficacy. And just to show you that how we should invest very early, we may get our results which are not very good immediately, but they'll come on long term. This is a driverless car from the Google. This is now done more than, I think, 1 million miles on the road in San Francisco, and some parts of the United States is coming into being. In fact, 10 years back, the Defense Association in United States, the DARPS, actually tried to create this driverless cars, and they had competitions in Pittsburgh. Many cars came driverless, but none of them actually finished the race. They started breaking down at 4 miles or 5 miles and so on. The race was 150 miles. Only last year, one of the cars actually finished the race, and this year we already have examples of the car. So it took 10 years for the technology to develop, but the defense had money so they could invest on this. And this is what I think we should think of long term, that it will be one small step at a time, but over a period of time, these innovations will make a change in the patient's lives. And the reason why there should be an acceleration of innovation in endoscopy is what is happening in other places, that we have an enormously improved access to information. We have easier access to experts. You can just get together in a video conferencing now so easily. There are better materials. Engineering materials have improved dramatically. In fact, so much so that as if you go to any engineering workshops, you realize there's a huge difference in the materials that are available now. And powerful tools are there for building, and it's easier to learn new skills. All this should result in better innovations. And I think the way to do it, of course, is networking. And this is, again, a very interesting book by Michael Nelson, where he talks about networking in science to increase the discovery. And this is what we should be doing. In fact, this was an interesting article by Ashish, who's actually an associate professor for biodesigning. He's a gastroenterologist, but he's a professor of biodesigning at Stanford. And what he suggests is that how we should now innovate in endoscopy is to identify a problem. Don't depend on the industry to give you the instrument. Identify the clinical problem, invent what could be done for that, and then implement it. And I changed it a little. Identify the problem, network with other interdisciplinary areas, then invent something which is going to be implemented for this. I think this, if you follow this approach, I'm sure our innovations would improve. In fact, Steven Spielberg, the famous filmmaker, said that there's nothing like science fiction. In science, everything will eventually become a reality. It will become a reality, but unfortunately, in gastrointestinal endoscopy, it's too slow. We want it to be faster. And of course, it becomes faster when you have leaders like Joseph who actually write these innovations, who actually lead these innovations. But also, endoscopy is a teamwork, and I'm fortunate that in our institute, we have a great team working together from different disciples. And finally, with the permission of the chair, I'd like to invite you all to see some of these new innovations, hopefully, in 2017 at the World Congress in Hyderabad. Thank you for your attention.